You are a clergyman in the year 1396, standing within the chilly stone corridors of Westminster Abbey. Your breath forms small clouds in the crisp autumn air as you hold your prayer book tightly, observing with awe as attendants rush about, getting ready for what the courtiers quietly claim will be the most extraordinary royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has arrived from France, a princess, they say, the daughter of King Charles himself. You have officiated numerous weddings before, and united many couples in holy matrimony, yet never have you witnessed such excitement at court. When the grand oak doors swing open and the wedding procession enters, your eyes widen in shock. The groom, King Edward II, stands tall and dignified at 29, his golden hair shimmering in the soft light pouring through the stained glass windows. Next to him walks what looks like a child, hardly reaching his elbow. Her tiny hand is completely engulfed in his gloved palm. She appears no older than 6 or 7 years, this little princess adorned in an elaborate French dress, her dark hair braided with pearls that seem too heavy for her delicate head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. Throughout your life, you have seen brides as young as 12 or 13. Political unions were the custom among noble families. After all, you grasp the reality of your era. Life is short and unpredictable. The Great Plague swept through just 50 years earlier, claiming half the population. Monarchs must forge alliances whenever possible, and marriages secure agreements more firmly than any document or stamp. As the ceremony starts, you observe the child's expression. She appears more intrigued than scared. Her large dark eyes absorb the magnificence surrounding her, the towering Gothic arches, the glowing candles, the nobles dressed in their finest silks and velvets. When King Edward recites his vows, his tone is soft, nearly protective. This is not a cruel man taking a child bride out of selfish desire. This is a king carrying out his responsibility to his kingdom, establishing peace with France through this most sacred union. The union will not be consummated. Everyone knows this. The young queen will be brought up and educated at the English court until she reaches adulthood. It is the custom. You pronounce their marriage with a calm voice, though your heart races as you declare them husband and wife. Watching this tiny girl become the Queen of England, you cannot avoid wondering what destiny holds for her in the perilous world of royal politics. Before we dive into these forgotten tales of endurance and hardship, if you enjoy uncovering hidden historical truths, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. And kindly share in the comments where you are watching from. It amazes me that we are discovering these ancient stories together from all corners of the globe, united. Throughout history and across distances, our common fascination with the past connects us deeply. The marriage of Elizabeth Valois to Edward II was never designed to be a tale of romance. Instead, it represented a brilliant display of medieval strategy, a mere pawn shifted on the grand chessboard of politics to bring an end to one of the most catastrophic disputes in European history, the 100 Years' War. To truly grasp Elizabeth's destiny, it is essential to first grasp the world she was born into and the forces that would influence her short and sorrowful existence. Elizabeth entered the world on the 9th of November, 1389, within the walls of the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled sovereigns. Her father, King Charles VI of France, battled with episodes of mental instability that likely caused many frightening experiences for the young princess. Known in history as Charles the Mad, his condition would swing him from competent leadership to bouts of madness, where he would forget who he was, imagine himself as fragile as glass, or refuse to wash for extended periods. Picture Elizabeth's upbringing in the luxurious yet volatile French court. One moment, her father might hold her on his lap, lavishing her with affection and presence. The next, she could see him retreating into corners, screaming about imminent assassins, or standing perfectly still for hours, convinced any movement would cause his glass body to shatter into countless pieces. The palace staff would hurriedly. During those episodes, the children were kept away, Yet the fear and uncertainty still reflected deeply in young Elizabeth's eyes. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a strong and commanding woman striving to maintain unity in the kingdom throughout her husband's times of incapacity. Beautiful and astute, Isabella harbored her own political goals and understood more clearly than most that her children were valuable pawns in the intricate game of European power struggles. She observed her eldest daughter with sharp, calculating intent, knowing that Elizabeth's charm and royal heritage would one day forge a vital alliance for France. The era Elizabeth entered was marked by near-constant warfare. For almost 60 years, England and France had been ensnared in a merciless conflict that wasted both nations. The 100 Years' War originated from English claims to the French crown. However, it soon transformed into a much more complicated battle for national identity, economic supremacy, and territorial control, impacting entire generations. French villages lay in ruins due to English invasions. English nobility drained their wealth-funding campaigns across the sea. Both countries were worn down, their finances depleted, and their populations weary from endless battles. By the decade of the 1990s, quiet murmurs of peace could be heard in the halls of power. Yet peace required much more than mere words. It demanded connections that were not easily broken. This is where 6-year-old Elizabeth was introduced into the grand stage of European diplomacy. The concept of her marriage became central to creating bonds that might finally bring stability between the two kingdoms. Elizabeth to Edward II first appeared during covert talks between French and English envoys in the year 1395. Edward had been deeply shaken by the loss of his cherished first spouse, Anne of Bohemia, the year before. Anne had been renowned as kind Queen Anne, beloved by the people of England for her compassion and generosity. Her passing due to plague had left Edward not only heartbroken, but also without an heir, a perilous state for any ruler of the medieval era. Edward's counselors pressed him to wed again swiftly, yet the English monarch was hesitant at first. His union with Anne had been one born of true affection, uncommon among royal marriages. The idea of replacing her seemed like a dishonor to her memory, yet responsibility to the kingdom finally surpassed personal feeling. When French delegates came forward with an offer that promised to conclude the conflict, Edward started to pay attention. The French proposal was bold in its ambitions. They presented not merely the hand of the monarch's eldest daughter, but also a dowry of 800,000 French francs, a staggering fortune that would greatly replenish England's war-drained coffers. Even more importantly, they offered a truce lasting 28 years, sufficient for an entire generation to grow up without experiencing warfare. However, there was one notable challenge. Elizabeth was merely 6 years old, which by medieval norms was exceptionally young for a royal bride. The majority of political alliances involved young women who were at least nearing their teenage years. The French negotiators insisted that Isabella's youth was actually a benefit. The marriage would represent a fresh start, free from the animosity and bloodshed that had previously defined relations between the two realms. Elizabeth would be brought up within the English court, absorbing English traditions and loyalties. By the time she reached an age suitable to serve as queen consort, she would embody both English and French identities equally. Edward's advisors were split in opinion. Some recognized the sagacity of the proposal. The dowry alone promised to support the royal household for many years, while the extended peace accord would allow England to attend to other dangers, notably the rising influence of Scotland and perpetual uprisings in Ireland. Others, however, expressed concern about the precedent of marrying such a young child, worrying it might scandalize even the conservative medieval aristocracy. Yet Edward was captivated by something quite different. Those at court observed that his expression softened upon viewing the tiny portrait of Isabella sent by the French envoys. Here stood a child in need of protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps some speculated the king who lacked children saw in this union not simply a political pact, but also a chance to become a father as well as a spouse. The negotiations extended over several months, with envoys repeatedly crossing the channel to finalize the complex terms. Every detail regarding Isabella's life was discussed and precisely established. She was to keep her French attendants and ladies-in-waiting. She was permitted to observe French traditions and keep in touch with her family. Most importantly, everyone involved agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached full physical maturity, a safeguard explicitly outlined in the treaty. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella amused herself with her dolls, completely unaware that her destiny was being decided in council rooms and recorded in documents sealed with wax and ribbons. Her instructors began teaching her English expressions, and dressmakers started sewing a trousseau suitable for a queen. She was told that she would marry a great king from across the sea, but at 6 years old, this idea was as intangible to her as the fairy tales her caretakers recounted before bedtime. The wedding ceremony happened twice, illustrating the diplomatic intricacies of the alliance. Isabella was barely 7 years old when she married Edward II at the English-held port of Cala on October 31st, 1396. This first ceremony was a private affair, attended mainly by diplomats and noble officials from both realms. Cala, being English territory on French soil, served as neutral ground for this significant occasion. Standing inside the Grand Hall of Cala Castle, Isabella must have felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wore a heavy gown made of golden fabric, adorned with intricate embroidery and pearls, so cumbersome she needed assistance walking. Her husband knelt to meet her gaze and exchanged rings with her, and witnesses mentioned how gently he lifted her chin when she appeared frightened by the crowd around them. Nobles gazed intently at her. A year later, she was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey. Reportedly, several individuals perished in the crowds trying to catch a glimpse of the well-known young bride. The English populace had heard stories about their new youthful queen, and curiosity attracted enormous throngs to London for the coronation. The event itself was an impressive exhibition of royal splendor meant to demonstrate to both English aristocracy and foreign guests that this remarkable marriage enjoyed complete backing from the monarchy. Elizabeth proceeded through the streets of London in a carriage adorned with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the alliance of the two realms. She wore a crown crafted especially for her petite head, and her gown was carried by English duchesses appointed as her protectors and instructors. The assembled crowds shouted blessings in English, which she was only starting to comprehend, yet she smiled and waved as she had been taught. The feast following the coronation extended over 3 days, featuring entertainment such as jugglers, musicians, and intricate theatrical performances, representing the promising future the union would bring to both kingdoms. Elizabeth sat at the high table beside Edward, delicately picking at her meal, guided by the refined etiquette her French mentors had instilled. Meanwhile, nobles raised their glasses in honor of the young queen's health. Yet despite the ongoing festivities, seasoned courtiers were beginning to question the durability of this fragile peace. Medieval treaties, no matter how carefully arranged, were always precarious. Edward II, despite his current authority, did not enjoy universal support among his nobles. Murmurs of dissatisfaction circulated, especially from those who believed the king was overly influenced by his favorites and too eager to seek peace with France, even when England held a strong military advantage. For now, however, Elizabeth was secure in her new residence. Edward established her in private chambers at Westminster Palace, accompanied by a meticulously selected entourage that combined French and English servants. Her days were devoted to lessons, not only in languages and refined courtly skills, but also in the intricate customs of English court life. She learned to perform the English curtsy, to choose wine instead of ale during meals, and to speak English with the court's distinctive accent, rather than the one taught by her French instructors. Edward personally took a keen interest in her education and well-being. Histories from the time mention him visiting her rooms frequently, bringing presents from across his kingdom, exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, and musical instruments created by London's finest craftsmen. He appeared to truly enjoy her company, and she began to anticipate his visits, meeting him with a blend of formality and warmth that highlighted their unique bond. The other children at court soon embraced Elizabeth as one of their own. Royal medieval households, usually. The group included many young aristocrats being brought up and educated alongside the royal family. Elizabeth developed a close friendship with the daughters of Edward's supporters, girls near her own age, who guided her through the intricate social hierarchies and unspoken customs of English nobility. Her dearest friend was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Edward's half-brothers. Although Margaret was only 2 years older than Elizabeth, she appeared worldly and refined to the young queen. Margaret introduced Elizabeth to English children's games, helped her discern which ladies-in-waiting were trustworthy with confidential matters, and warned her about the political tensions that even children could not fully avoid. The two friends would spend long hours in Elizabeth's private garden honing their needlework, while Margaret recounted the family trees of English noble houses and the long-standing rivalries still simmering beneath the veneer of courtly politeness. Elizabeth was a fast learner, and her French perspective on English politics often offered surprising observations to her elder peers. Once Elizabeth asked Margaret, "Why do the English nobles seem to watch each other so closely? In France there are rivalries and disputes, but here everyone appears to be waiting for something to unfold." Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Edward's reign had been marked by ongoing clashes with his nobles nearly from the start. During his youth, a significant uprising had taken place, and he had never fully forgiven those who had stood against him. At the same time, numerous influential lords felt that Edward showed excessive favoritism toward his court companions and was too ready to disregard their counsel regarding military issues and state affairs. Margaret remarked that the king holds considerable power now, yet in England, such authority must be shared with the aristocracy. She explained that the marriage supports him by securing peace with France, but some perceive it as a sign of weakness, suggesting he favors diplomacy over conquest. Elizabeth absorbed these insights with the gravity of a child, beginning to realize that her existence was entwined with much larger forces beyond her control. She started observing the dynamics at court through a new lens, noting how certain nobles would fall silent upon Edward's arrival, how discussions shifted when she made an appearance, and how even her French attendants seemed to pick their words carefully when political topics surfaced. The years 1397 and 1398 passed quietly for Elizabeth. She matured from a small child into a more self-assured young girl whose English grew fluent and whose understanding of court life became increasingly refined. Edward continued to show her a fatherly kindness, and she truly began to feel at ease in England. The imposing stone walls of Westminster stopped feeling intimidating and instead became familiar, enabling her to find her way through the intricate labyrinth of halls and chambers without losing her path. Her education progressed steadily, grounding her further in this complex world. Her education extended far beyond the usual accomplishments expected of women, such as sewing and music. Edward insisted that she master reading and writing in both French and English, and her instructors were among the most esteemed scholars in the kingdom. She immersed herself in history, focusing especially on the annals of English and French monarchs, discovering the prominent figures whose deeds had shaped the world she now lived in. One of her most cherished lessons involved studying maps. Her teacher, a knowledgeable clerk named Master William, would spread large sheets of parchment across the floor of her study room, illustrating the vastness of both realms and explaining how geography had influenced centuries of warfare. Elizabeth would kneel beside these maps, following the coastlines with her finger, imagining the ships that transported soldiers and envoys across the channel. "Look here, Your Grace," Master William would say, indicating the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This slender stretch of sea has served as both a link and a barrier between our peoples. Your marriage symbolizes the hope that it may finally become solely a connection." Elizabeth nodded with solemn understanding, even at 8 years old, realizing that she represented something greater than herself. She was not merely a girl preparing to become a queen, but a living emblem of peace between two nations that had been adversaries for countless generations. Yet, as Elizabeth was soon to realize, Such symbols could be delicate in the harsh and tumultuous arena of medieval politics. The initial signs of trouble appeared in the early months of 1399, when Elizabeth sensed a shift in the atmosphere at court. Conversations would halt abruptly whenever she entered the room. Her attendants exchanged uneasy looks whenever they believed she was not paying attention. Even Margaret Holland appeared restless and uneasy, though she attempted to keep their regular routines intact. Edward himself seemed altered. His visits to Elizabeth's chambers grew less common, and when he did come, he seemed distracted, often gazing out the windows toward the Thames, as if searching for ships on the horizon. His usual presence of books and small treasures stopped, and Elizabeth began to worry whether she had somehow upset him. The reality was far more grave than a minor conflict between them. Edward was confronting the most critical challenge of his reign, which had nothing to do with his young wife. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, whom Edward had banished the year before, had returned to England with an army, claiming he intended to reclaim only his inheritance, but his ambitions were clearly greater. The English nobility, many of whom had long resented Edward's leadership, started rallying around Henry's cause. The fragile order that had allowed Elizabeth to feel secure in the English court was dissolving with alarming speed. Elizabeth first comprehended the gravity of the crisis when she awoke one morning to discover that several of her English attendants had vanished during the night. When she realized this, a deep fear took hold. When she inquired of her French attendants where they had gone, their answers were vague and evasive. By the afternoon, voices shouting echoed from the courtyard beneath her windows, and upon looking out, she noticed armed men dressed in unfamiliar uniforms. That evening, Margaret Holland rushed into Elizabeth's chambers, her face drained of color due to fear. "You must pack immediately," she said in a hushed urgency. "Only take the bare necessities. We are leaving Westminster tonight." Elizabeth asked, her heart quickening with a panic she had not experienced since her earliest days in England. "To the Tower," Margaret replied. "The king claims it is for your protection," but she did not finish. Elizabeth understood perfectly well. The Tower of London served as both royal residence and prison, and during political turmoil, the line between the two often disappeared. The passage through London's shadowy streets was unlike anything Elizabeth had encountered before. Instead of the grand ceremonial parades she once knew, she was transported in a small convoy heavily protected by armed guards, riding both ahead and behind her carriage. The curtains were tightly drawn, but the ambient sounds of the city outside were different. Not the typical bustle of trade and everyday life, but something tense and ominous. Upon arrival at the Tower, Elizabeth was assigned to quarters that, while comfortable, were clearly built to confine rather than merely accommodate. The windows were secured with bars, and vigilant guards were posted at every door. Her French ladies-in-waiting were permitted to stay by her side, but most of her English attendants were sent away. For the first time since her arrival in England, Elizabeth felt genuinely alone. Edward visited her on her second day at the Tower, and his transformation was startling. The assured and kind ruler she had once known had vanished, replaced by a man who appeared to have aged decades within a few weeks. His clothes were disheveled, his hair messy, and his eyes carried a wildness that made Elizabeth uneasy, recalling her father's moments of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had on their first meeting, "I am afraid our situation has become troubling. Some challenge my claim to the throne and wish to undo the peace we have established with your father's realm." Elizabeth, now 9 years old, and much more aware than she had been 3 years earlier, grasped the seriousness of his words. "Are you still king?" she asked straightforwardly. Edward's smile was filled with sorrow. "For now, yes, but Henry Boling has swayed many supporters, and I may no longer be able to shield you as I did before." The dialogue that followed was unlike any before. For the first time, Edward addressed Elizabeth not as a child to be protected, but as a political partner who needed to comprehend her harsh reality. He revealed that Henry was asserting his claim to the crown, and that numerous, the influential nobles had deserted Edward's cause, and the fate of both England and the fragile peace with France now trembled on the edge. "What will become of me?" Elizabeth inquired, showing a calmness that would be astounding for an adult, let alone a 9-year-old child. "I am not sure," Edward confessed, and Elizabeth noticed how deeply this uncertainty troubled him. "Henry might try to use you as leverage against your father, or he could honor our union and continue to safeguard you. Much depends on whether he prioritizes peace with France over his personal ambitions." This was Elizabeth's first harsh lesson in the ruthless calculations of medieval power. Her worth as an individual mattered less than her role as a symbol and a diplomatic tool. The affection and protection Edward had shown her, no matter how sincere, could not shield her from the overwhelming forces transforming the English realm. The following weeks dragged by in painful suspense. Elizabeth could hear the city's noises beyond the tower's walls, yet she was cut off from trustworthy news about the unfolding events. Her French attendants whispered quietly among themselves in their native language, but even they seemed to know little beyond rumors and guesses. At last, on a dull October morning, Elizabeth heard the sound she had feared most, the heavy steps of armed men coming toward her chamber. When the doors swung open, she did not see the familiar guards she had grown used to, but instead new men clad in the red rose emblem of Edward Boling entered. The man who followed was tall and commanding, carrying the demeanor of a soldier combined with the shrewd gaze of a statesman. This was Edward himself, now Edward IV of England, arriving to meet the girl who embodied both a challenge and an opportunity for his fresh rule. Elizabeth stood from her seat and performed a deep curtsy, as she had been instructed upon encountering a monarch. Edward observed her silently for some time, noting her composure, her clear intellect, and perhaps weighing how he might benefit from her. "Your Grace," he said with formality, and Elizabeth noticed he still addressed her by her royal style. "I regret that the situation forces us to discuss your future in these circumstances. What has happened to the king?" Elizabeth inquired plainly, referring to Edward with the frankness that had become a part of her nature. "Edward of Bordeaux is no longer king," Edward replied, employing Edward's original name instead of his royal title. "He has relinquished his crown in favor of my claim." Elizabeth understood enough about governance to realize that relinquished probably meant was compelled to surrender his crown, but she did not question the soft term. Instead, she posed the question that was most critical for her immediate destiny: what will become of me? Edward's response would decide if Elizabeth stayed a queen or turned into simply a precious captive. Her future depended entirely on the new monarch's evaluation of the most advantageous way to handle the peace accord with France, whether to uphold, whether to risk conflict for the sake of other political goals. Edward explained, "Depends on several elements: your father's reaction to recent events, the counsel of my advisors, and perhaps most crucially, your own behavior in the coming months." With these words, 9-year-old Elizabeth stepped into the most perilous chapter of her young existence. The sheltered environment of Edward's court had vanished, replaced by the stark truths of a kingdom undergoing change. She was no longer merely a child monarch being prepared to meet her royal responsibilities. She had become a political captive whose worth could be weighed against the price of war or peace. The weeks after Edward's removal highlighted Elizabeth's mastery of survival. Though confined to the tower and not yet officially imprisoned, she had to skillfully maneuver through the dangerous currents of a court still uncertain about her fate. Some of Charles's followers insisted she be sent back to France without delay, to save on the costs of her household, and to demonstrate that England was poised to renegotiate the peace accord from a position of authority. Others advised prudence, noting that Elizabeth's presence afforded England leverage in any upcoming talks with France. As long as she remained under English care, her father would hesitate to take actions that might threaten her safety. This group contended she should live comfortably, but remain under vigilant supervision. Elizabeth herself played an active role in this delicate balance. Elizabeth handled her role with impressive poise for someone so young. She always showed courtesy to her new captives, careful to avoid causing offense or seeming to conspire against Henry's regime. Yet she upheld the dignity fitting her status, refusing to accept anything less than the title of queen that she rightfully held. Her French ladies-in-waiting were an essential support during this challenging time. Unlike her English attendants, who had been dismissed or escaped, these loyal women prioritized Elizabeth's interests instead of aligning with any English faction. They guided her through the delicate complexities of her circumstances and coached her on the careful balance she needed to sustain. Remember, her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducy, advised, "You remain Queen of England in the eyes of the law and your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he has not yet dared to end your marriage or officially reject the treaty. As long as that holds, you have worth, and where there is worth, there is hope." Yet this hope came at a terrible price, one Elizabeth was only beginning to grasp. Information started reaching the Tower about Edward's fate. At first, rumors circulated that he had perished while imprisoned at Pontefract Castle. Later, whispers suggested his death was not natural, that Henry's followers had orchestrated an accident for the former king. When Elizabeth finally received confirmation of Edward's death, the news struck her with a force she had not anticipated. Elizabeth had never truly loved Edward in the way a wife cherishes her husband. How could she have done so when she was barely more than a child? Yet he had treated her kindly, protected her, and served as the closest figure to a father she had known since leaving France. Edward's passing was not only a deeply personal loss, but also the breaking of her final link to the life she had started in England. The circumstances surrounding Edward's death hinted at dangerous consequences for Elizabeth herself. If Henry was prepared to orchestrate the murder of a crowned king, what limits could he possibly have when it came to getting rid of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? These fears were soon confirmed when, at the beginning of 1400, Elizabeth received a harsh ultimatum from Henry's administration. She could return to France, but only on condition that she officially recognized Henry as the legitimate ruler of England and relinquished any claim to the English throne as Edward's widow. From Henry's standpoint, the proposed arrangement was a diplomatic triumph. By agreeing to leave England willingly, Elizabeth would be tacitly accepting that her marriage to Edward was nullified by his removal from power. This would relieve Henry of all duties under the original peace treaty, while avoiding the political mess of forcibly expelling a young queen. For Elizabeth, the dilemma was clear and painful. Either she accepted exile, admitting that her 3 years as Queen of England were void, or she refused and faced the possibility of lifelong imprisonment. At the age of 10, she faced a choice that would shape not only her own destiny, but also the future relationship between England and France for many years ahead. Her French advisors were split in opinion. Some believed she ought to accept the proposal and return to the protection of her father's court, where she would receive proper care and possibly secure another marriage eventually. Others argued she should reject the offer, insisting that she remained Edward's lawful widow and the true Queen of England, despite Henry's usurpation. Elizabeth wrestled with this dilemma for several weeks. Part of her yearned to return to France, reunite with her family, and escape the uncertain atmosphere of Henry's court. Yet another part understood that accepting Henry's conditions would betray Edward's legacy and forsake the peace he died attempting to safeguard. Ultimately, the choice was taken out of her hands by circumstances beyond her influence. During a clear spell, Charles V sent a message expecting his daughter's immediate return to France. The communication, conveyed through official diplomatic channels, made it abundantly clear that any delay or further talks regarding Elizabeth's status would be seen as an act of aggression by the French crown. Confronted with the threat of renewed conflict with France, Henry's administration quickly consented to Elizabeth's departure. The details of her release agreement were kept confidential. The wording was intentionally ambiguous, allowing both parties to see her return as either voluntary or compelled, depending on their political interests. The trip back to France during the summer of the year 1401 was filled with mixed emotions for Elizabeth. She was leaving behind the only home she had known for 5 years, forsaking the rooms where she had discovered English poetry, the gardens where she had played alongside Margaret Holland, and the grand hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. Yet at the same time, she was going back to a family and a land that had grown unfamiliar to her, Over those years spent in England, she now spoke French with a subtle English accent, favored English styles over French ones, and needed to reacquaint herself with the manners expected at her father's court. The young girl who had left Paris at the age of 6 was now returning as an 11-year-old, shaped by experiences beyond the understanding of any of her French relatives. The meeting with her parents was further complicated by her father's worsening mental state. Charles VI was in the grip of one of his most severe episodes when Elizabeth arrived, convinced he was being chased by invisible foes and unable to recognize his own family. When he eventually emerged from his madness several weeks later, he appeared bewildered by Elizabeth's presence, as if he had forgotten that she had been wed to the English king. Her mother, Isabella, was warmer but also more strategic. The Queen of France quickly began to contemplate how Elizabeth held a distinctive position that could be leveraged to promote French interests. As the widow of an English monarch, Elizabeth possessed a certain diplomatic standing that might prove useful in upcoming negotiations. More immediately, her time spent at the English court provided her with valuable insights into English politics and military strength. Elizabeth found herself torn between these conflicting demands on her loyalty and the knowledge she carried. Born in France and having returned to her homeland, she also had once been Queen of England and felt a subtle sense of duty towards the country she had once called home. When her mother's advisors inquired about English defenses or King Henry's backing among the nobility, Elizabeth responded with caution, sharing broad information while avoiding specifics that could assist in military strategy. The months after her return to France marked a time of adjustment and introspection. She was no longer a girl, but was still on the path to full adulthood. At 11 years old, she had already endured more political turmoil and personal grief than many experience over a lifetime. The pressing question remained what role she would adopt in the intricate realm of medieval European politics. Elizabeth's former status as Queen of England made her a highly desirable candidate for marriage among European aristocrats, but this also complicated potential alliances. Several prospective suitors were daunted by her regal rank and the political weight she carried, making any match a delicate and complex matter. Others were more focused on the political benefits of marrying Elizabeth rather than on Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth, on her side, had formed firm views about marriage based on her time with Edward. She had observed how political unions could offer security and steadiness. However, she had also seen how quickly these agreements might fall apart when situations shifted. Any future spouse would have to recognize that she was more than just a diplomatic tool, but a young woman with her own intellect, tastes, and goals. The French court in the year 1400 was a perilous environment for someone like Elizabeth with divided loyalties. The ongoing conflict with England fueled strong anti-English feelings among the aristocracy, and Elizabeth's years as Queen of England caused some courtiers to regard her with mistrust. She had to be cautious not to seem overly supportive of English causes while also not hiding the true fondness she had for Edward and some of his allies. Meanwhile, her father's mental health issues meant that the French government was mainly controlled by rival groups of nobles, each trying to push their own agendas. Elizabeth needed to skillfully maneuver through these rivalries without becoming a pawn for any faction. Her mother, Isabella, acted as both a guardian and a potential danger. The Queen of France sincerely cared about Elizabeth's well-being, but was also a shrewd political player who saw Edward viewed his daughter's experiences and connections as valuable assets for the crown. The protection granted by Isabeau came with expectations that Isabella would prioritize French interests, even when these clashed with her personal preferences or ethical beliefs. In the year 1402, new challenges emerged as Isabella learned that Henry IV was struggling with severe rebellions throughout England. The Percy family, once loyal supporters, had betrayed him, while uprisings also erupted in Wales and Scotland. Some members of the French court saw this as a chance to launch an invasion of England and reinstate the rightful dynasty, potentially positioning Isabella as a symbolic figure, the legitimizing widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella was appalled by these conversations. She had no wish to witness England torn apart by civil conflict. Regardless of her opinions about Henry's behavior, the English people she had known, her servants, her teachers, her childhood friends, were innocent of the political wrongdoings committed by their leaders. The thought of French troops devastating English villages in her name caused her great distress. When directly asked for her stance on possible military intervention against England, Isabella chose her words with great care. She emphasized that an invasion would almost certainly lead to overwhelming casualties on both sides, that the English population might unite fiercely to defend their homeland, no matter their feelings toward Henry, and that success in such an endeavor was far from guaranteed. The outcome was uncertain due to England's natural defenses and long-standing military customs. Her hesitation to support actions against England earned her criticism from the more aggressive French factions, who accused her of divided allegiance. However, Elizabeth's stance found backing among the more moderate courtiers, who believed that maintaining peaceful ties with England better served France's interests than engaging in another war. These political conflicts reached a critical point in the year 1403, when Elizabeth was approached by envoys of Charles, Duke of Orleans, with a marriage proposal that would once more transform her life. The Duke of Orleans was Elizabeth's cousin, the son of her father's brother, and a leading noble in France. He was 29, precisely the age Edward had been when he wed Elizabeth, although now the age difference appeared less striking considering Elizabeth was nearing her 14th birthday. The suggested union had several appealing aspects. It would keep Elizabeth within the French royal lineage, preventing her from becoming a bargaining chip for foreign powers. Additionally, it would connect her with one of Europe's most refined and cultured courts, known as a supporter of arts and letters, as well as a skilled military leader. The Duke of Orleans offered Elizabeth a chance for a marriage founded on mutual esteem instead of purely political motives. Having met her cousin several times during childhood, she recalled that he had always treated her with kindness and respect. With respect and warmth, he brought qualities that made him not just a guardian, but a genuine partner, marked by his maturity and considerable experience. The talks surrounding this union unfolded amid ongoing turmoil in England and a rising French confidence that Henry IV's rule might not withstand its initial trials. Should Henry lose power, there was always the chance that Isabella could be summoned back to England to endorse a new government. From the French viewpoint, this possibility made the timing of Isabella's remarriage extremely important. Charles of Orleans grasped the sensitivity of the circumstances. He was looking for more than a spouse. He was potentially aligning himself with a woman who could be asked later to influence English affairs. This added an unusual degree of complexity to their courtship that surpassed typical medieval noble marriages. When Isabella met Charles to seriously discuss the marriage for the first time, she noticed how distinct he was from Edward. Whereas Edward had been gentle and somewhat ethereal, Charles was ardent and deeply connected to the world surrounding him. He addressed her not as a child needing protection, but as an equal whose views and life experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he said during one private talk, "that I'm not seeking to wed the former Queen of England. I wish to marry Isabella of Valois, the extraordinary young woman who has endured so much." Elizabeth navigated the courts of two realms and emerged with her honor preserved. She found herself sincerely drawn to Charles in a manner she had never encountered before. At the age of 14, she was no longer a child, and the emotions awakening inside her were those of a young woman uncovering her own wishes and inclinations. Charles was attractive, educated, and wise, but most importantly, he appeared to regard her as a person rather than just a political tool. The marriage talks advanced quickly once both sides agreed on the main conditions. Elizabeth offered her status as a former queen and her influential political ties to the union, while Charles promised her a secure role within French society, along with protection against those who might attempt to exploit her. The wedding was held in June of 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. This ceremony was intentionally designed to stand in stark contrast to Elizabeth's first wedding, which had been a modest diplomatic event with Edward. This celebration was a magnificent display meant to showcase the strength and wealth of the French royal family. Now aged 16, Elizabeth wore a deep blue silk gown adorned with golden embroidery, her dark hair topped with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She walked confidently down the aisle of the Grand Cathedral, no longer the scared child married off to a stranger, but a young woman forging her own destiny. Edward stood at the altar in his finest attire, his expression revealing true joy, rather than just the satisfaction of political duty. When they exchanged their vows, their voices were clear and confident, and onlookers noticed they gazed directly at each other instead of merely reciting words to fulfill political obligations. The wedding celebration that followed displayed the richness of French culture and might. Troubadours performed ballads honoring the newlyweds. Grand theatrical shows portrayed love's victory over hardship, while the finest wines from all over the kingdom were enjoyed without restraint. Elizabeth found herself letting go and savoring the festivities like never before during her years in England. More significantly, she felt for the first time since leaving France as a child, a genuine sense of belonging. The French court welcomed her back not as a failed political symbol, but as a cherished member of the royal family, one who had gained insight and strength through her experiences. The first years of Elizabeth's marriage to Charles were some of the most joyful of her life. Charles showed himself to be not only a devoted spouse, but also a thoughtful companion who shared her passions for literature, music, and the arts. His court at Bly grew into a hub of cultural sophistication, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Elizabeth embraced her new role with great enthusiasm. She supported troubadours and creative minds, becoming a true patron of the arts and further enriching the vibrant atmosphere that surrounded them both. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts and set up a scriptorium where monks could copy and safeguard essential texts while maintaining communication with scholars across Europe. Her time in England had provided her with a distinctive understanding of European culture, which she used to encourage intellectual dialogue between French and foreign courts. At the same time, she began to find her own voice in politics. Charles valued her knowledge of English matters, but even more, he admired her judgment on numerous topics that affected their duchy and the kingdom as a whole. Elizabeth gradually became a genuine partner in governance, far beyond just a ceremonial spouse. Their first child, a daughter named Yin, arrived in the year 1407. Elizabeth embraced motherhood with the same passion she devoted to every part of her life. Determined to be a more involved mother than her own had been during the turmoil of her father's rule, she insisted on breastfeeding the baby herself. This went against the advice of court physicians who deemed such a task unsuitable for a duchess. Holding her daughter for the first time, Elizabeth experienced an overwhelming feeling of fulfillment. This child would be raised under the care and love of her parents, spared from the political intrigues that had marred Elizabeth's youth. She softly made promises to the sleeping child in both French and English, ensuring that Jeanne would have freedoms Elizabeth had never known. The arrival of their daughter deepened the connection between Elizabeth and Charles. Charles showed himself as a caring parent, dedicating moments to Jeanne despite the heavy demands from his roles in politics and the military. Elizabeth frequently discovered him in the nursery, either immersed in reading stories to their child or quietly observing her slumber, amazed by the wonder of the new life they had brought into the world together. Yet while Elizabeth cherished her family bliss, the wider reality kept imposing itself. The reports from England were increasingly concerning, with Henry IV battling ongoing revolts and threats to his rule. A more immediate danger emerged from within France itself, where the king's mental health issues resulted in a leadership gap that rival noble groups eagerly sought to occupy. Elizabeth's father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, ranked among the most ambitious of these. Being the king's brother, he asserted his right to govern during the times when Charles V was incapacitated. However, this was challenged by the Duke of Burgundy, who commanded his own faction and envisioned a different future for France. the conflict between the Orleans and Burgundian parties would later fracture France deeply. In the early days of Elizabeth's marriage, this rivalry appeared as just another political struggle among many swirling through the royal court. Elizabeth aimed to remain detached from these divisive battles, concentrating on her household and cultural interests while leaving the political intrigue to others. This comfortable impartiality became impossible to uphold in November of the year 1407, when Louis of Orleans was assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. The murder was executed with a shocking level of audacity. The assassins struck down the king's brother openly in daylight before vanishing into the confusing labyrinth of Paris's medieval lanes. This killing changed Elizabeth's life drastically overnight. Charles, who had inherited his father's titles and duties, was suddenly among the most influential men in France, yet he was also a target. The Duke of Burgundy had proven his readiness to employ violence against his foes, and the Orleans family had become his main objective. Elizabeth found herself thrown into a world of bodyguards and unceasing caution. Her movements were limited for security reasons, and her letters were carefully guarded to prevent any details about her family's plans from reaching their enemies. The light-hearted atmosphere of their court at Biel was replaced by the harsh reality of civil strife. Charles himself underwent a transformation after his father's death. The refined and artistic young man Elizabeth had wed began to reveal a tougher aspect, fueled by a thirst for revenge that occasionally unnerved her. He started to assemble supporters and gather resources for what everyone expected to become a prolonged and brutal fight against the Burgundian faction. Elizabeth stood by her husband's cause, but feared the heavy toll the forthcoming war would demand. She had already witnessed the devastating impact political violence could have on lives and entire realms, and she feared that France might endure the same destiny England faced during the Wars of the Roses. Her worries proved accurate, as the struggle between the Orleans and Burgundian factions intensified into full-scale conflict. The birth of Elizabeth's second child, a boy named Charles in 1408, brought a momentary pause amid the political unrest. The arrival of a male heir not only reinforced the Orleans' claim to the future leadership of France, but also made Elizabeth's family a bigger target for their adversaries. Elizabeth took the upbringing of her son with even greater dedication than she had with John. She was resolute that Charles would understand both the privileges and duties tied to his noble birth, while also cultivating a character capable of navigating the dangerous world of medieval politics without losing his sense of humanity. She insisted on overseeing every part of his education, from choosing his instructors to shaping his study program. Drawing from her own time at the English court, she ensured Charles mastered several languages, studied the histories of various European kingdoms, and honed the diplomatic skills that would be vital for his future position. The early phase of the Civil War was marked by a series of confrontations and sieges that slowly drained the strength of both sides. Elizabeth found herself in charge of the family's lands while Charles was away on campaign, a duty that demanded she navigate the intricate logistics of medieval warfare and administration. She surprisingly excelled in these responsibilities, relying on her diplomatic talents to sustain alliances, and her organizational skills to guarantee that supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's troops exactly when required. The correspondence from this time shows a woman who had fully accepted her position as a political leader. No longer the uncertain child who had been passed from court to court, she had become a resolute woman steering her own fate. The war wreaked havoc across France. Whole territories were destroyed by rival armies. Trade routes were interrupted, and ordinary people endured hardships caused by marauding soldiers on both sides. Elizabeth used her influence to offer aid wherever possible, founding charitable organizations and arranging secure routes for refugees escaping the fiercest battles. Her commitment to assisting those affected by the conflict boosted her standing throughout France. She became known not merely as the Duchess of Orleans, but as a compassionate leader, mindful of her duties to the common folk. This earned respect would be crucial in the coming years, when French politics grew even more tangled. In 1409, the arrival of Elizabeth's third child, a daughter named Margarita, brought both happiness and concern. At 20 years old, Elizabeth faced the challenges of motherhood amid turbulent times. Repeated pregnancies severely impacted Elizabeth's well-being. The knowledge of maternal deaths in medieval times was limited, yet Elizabeth was astute enough to grasp the dangers each childbirth posed. She treated this particular pregnancy with exceptional caution, adhering to the counsel of the most skilled doctors and drafting thorough guidelines for the care of her offspring should she not survive. These preparations turned out to be remarkably foresighted, as problems during Margaret's birth nearly ended Elizabeth's life. For numerous days after the delivery, Elizabeth remained in a critical state, her body drained by blood loss and infection. Charles scarcely left her side, and envoys were dispatched across Europe asking for prayers for her recuperation. The threat of her death forced both Elizabeth and Charles to face the vulnerability of their joy and the uncertain fate awaiting their children. Elizabeth's healing process was gradual and never fully restored her health. The childbirth inflicted damage that weakened her permanently, making her vulnerable to the many diseases common in medieval times. Most urgently, her doctors warned that becoming pregnant again would probably be fatal. This counsel deeply influenced her relationship with Charles. Their physical closeness grew tentative and limited, clouded by the fear of another pregnancy. The transformation in their relationship proved challenging for both parties, especially for Elizabeth, who had once found immense happiness in the physical manifestation of their affection. The fervent young woman who had awakened to her own yearnings was now compelled to restrain them in order to ensure their survival. Despite these difficulties, Elizabeth and Charles's union remained resilient. They discovered alternative ways to showcase their love and collaboration, concentrating on mutual passions such as culture and politics. Elizabeth took a more active role in managing their domains, effectively acting as Charles's partner in leadership, while he waged campaigns against the Burgundians. In the year 1410, new difficulties arose when the Duke of Burgundy started negotiations with the English, aiming to involve Henry IV in the French internal conflict on Burgundy's behalf. The idea of English involvement deeply alarmed Elizabeth, who feared that France might endure the same destruction that had marked the 100 Years' War. Taking advantage of her unique experience as a former English queen, Elizabeth initiated secret communications with the English court. Using intermediaries, she sought to convince Henry IV that joining the French civil strife would be expensive and ultimately pointless. Although many in England remained wary of her, she relentlessly pursued efforts to prevent the outbreak of widespread warfare between the two nations. These diplomatic endeavors. Elizabeth's increasing finesse as a political strategist became evident. She realized that her influence extended beyond her royal lineage and rested significantly in her capacity to perceive the broader trends of Europe affairs and to devise plans that addressed various interests at the same time. The effectiveness of her diplomatic efforts raised her standing both in France and internationally. She was consulted not only on issues related to her husband's domains, but also on more expansive questions regarding French policy. Her views were respected due to her distinctive experiences and proven skill in handling intricate political challenges. Throughout 1411 and 1412, Elizabeth's health steadily worsened. The complications following Marguerite's birth weakened her defenses against respiratory illnesses, and she endured persistent exhaustion that made everyday tasks increasingly taxing. She devoted more moments to reflection and prayer, possibly sensing that her days might be numbered. Even with these physical struggles, Elizabeth maintained sharp mental faculties and remained emotionally committed to her family and duties. She took personal charge of her children's education, supervised the family's political matters, and indulged in her cultural pursuits. Her resolve to live meaningfully despite declining health inspired those around her. The spring of 1409 offered a brief glimmer of optimism when initial peace talks commenced between the Olin and Burgundian camps. Elizabeth took an active role in these discussions, demonstrating her political acumen and hopes for a resolution. Elizabeth played an important part in these talks, employing her diplomatic talents and her well-known fairness to help close the divide between the two parties. Even though the discussions ultimately ended without success, Elizabeth's efforts received widespread acclaim and boosted her reputation as a potential mediator in future disputes. Her skill in collaborating with envoys from both sides highlighted her political wisdom and her dedication to seeking peaceful resolutions to France's challenges. As the year 1409 advanced, Elizabeth's health deteriorated more noticeably. The persistent respiratory issues that had troubled her since her child Margaret's birth grew worse, and she began to endure the wasting illness that would eventually take her life. Medieval healers lacked knowledge of the tuberculosis likely responsible for her decline, but they recognized the severity of her condition. Elizabeth faced the possibility of death with the bravery she had shown all her life. She carefully arranged her children's future, ensuring their safety and education no matter what happened to her. She also worked to safeguard the political standing of her husband Charles's faction, aware that her passing could open the door for adversaries. Her final months were devoted to preparing for the end, while treasuring her remaining time with her family. She insisted on maintaining her daily routines as long as she could, determined not to become a burden. Beloved by many, her courage when facing a terminal illness became legendary, inspiring countless tales and melodies passed down through the years. Elizabeth of Valois passed away on September 13, 409, at the age of 20. Her life had stretched across 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, witnessing the peaks of royal authority and the troughs of political turmoil. Her passing was deeply mourned all over Europe, not only by her relatives and subjects, but also by the numerous individuals whose lives she had touched with her compassion and insight. The funeral procession that conveyed Elizabeth's remains to her final resting place at the Celestine Convent in Paris was among the grandest recorded in medieval France. Delegates from all across Europe arrived to honor a woman who exemplified the intricate balance of personal bravery and political duty that defined her era. Charles of Orleans was shattered by the loss of his wife. He had lost more than a cherished partner. He had lost a trusted counselor and political ally whose wisdom had been instrumental in his achievements. Though the sorrowful widower eventually found another marriage, he never ceased to remember Elizabeth or the joy they had shared during their fleeting union. Elizabeth's children grew to hold important roles in French and European affairs. Her son Charles became an acclaimed poet and supporter of the arts, while her daughters entered into strategic marriages that reinforced the Orleans family's influence and standing. They all upheld the principles their mother had deeply ingrained in them: bravery, empathy, and a dedication to employing their advantages to benefit others. The political repercussions of Elizabeth's passing resonated across France and beyond. Her loss eliminated a calming force within the civil conflict, intensifying the struggle between the Orlandan and Burgundian groups into a more vicious and destructive battle. The harmony she had tirelessly pursued remained out of reach, and France would continue to endure internal strife for many years ahead. Nonetheless, Elizabeth's influence reached far beyond the immediate political aftermath of her demise. She proved that even during a time when women were expected merely to be passive political tools, a determined person could forge a path for independent action and ethical leadership. Her life became an inspiration for other women confronting similar obstacles. Later generations of female rulers and political figures referred to Elizabeth's bravery and wisdom as an example when striving to push the limits of what women could achieve in the public sphere. Contemporary historians have occasionally found it challenging to fully grasp Elizabeth's narrative, torn between admiration for her accomplishments and discomfort with the reality that shaped her existence. The arranged marriage of a child just 6 years old to a man aged 29 strikes a stark contrast with today's views on childhood and free will, even when we acknowledge the political demands that influenced such arrangements. It is important not to evaluate Elizabeth's world by contemporary standards, as doing so overlooks the deep humanity within her story. She was born into a system where royal offspring were treated as instruments of diplomacy. Yet she succeeded in rising above these restrictions and building a life filled with true significance and achievement. Her marriages, regardless of their initial intentions, evolved into relationships founded on mutual respect and affection. The turmoil and political unrest characterizing her era were not caused by moral shortcomings, but stemmed from a reality where personal safety and political authority were continually in dispute. Elizabeth's skill in handling these difficulties while keeping her integrity and compassion intact highlights the lasting human ability for growth and ethical bravery. Her experience teaches us that history is not only about major military campaigns or changes in kingdoms, but about the individuals who lived through these times and influenced them through their decisions. Elizabeth of Valois decided to become more than just a product of her circumstances, and in doing so, left a legacy that surpasses the particular political arrangements of her era. Looking back through the ages, we observe in Elizabeth's life both the restrictions and the opportunities that have always defined human existence. She was limited by the societal and gender expectations of her period, but still managed to define her own path. She discovered ways to take control of her own life and to make significant impacts on the world she lived in. Her tale is ultimately one of endurance, sharp intellect, and a steadfast refusal to believe that seeking personal joy and fulfilling political duties cannot coexist. The medieval era that gave rise to Elizabeth of Valois was brutal and relentless in ways that are almost unimaginable today. Existence was fleeting, childhood passed quickly, and political bonds often came at the cost of human lives. Still, within these harsh boundaries, individuals like Elizabeth managed to forge beauty, demonstrate compassion, and cultivate meaningful connections that enriched their lives. Her heritage is not one of defeat, but of overcoming challenges that would have overwhelmed a weaker soul. Ultimately, Elizabeth's narrative reminds us that every period has its own ethical intricacies, and that those who lived long ago, despite their vastly different surroundings, shared the same basic human desires for love, safety, and meaning. To grasp her life story is to grasp a vital truth about humanity itself. We are shaped by our era, but possess the power to rise